The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Industries as Victoria Chen gathered her courage. Outside the mahogany doors of the executive suite, she had worked as James Sterling's personal assistant for 4 years, managing his impossible schedule and keeping his chaotic business life organized. What she hadn't managed was keeping her heart safe from falling for the brilliant but guarded billionaire. Treated her like she was invisible most days. Victoria smoothed her navy blazer and knocked twice before entering. James stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the Seattle skyline, his broad shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored suit. The office smelled of expensive cologne and fresh coffee, a combination that always made her pulse quicken despite her best efforts to remain professional. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Sterling?" Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the tablet containing his afternoon schedule. He turned slowly, and Victoria felt her breath catch. James Sterling at 35 was devastatingly handsome in a way that made her forget how to think clearly. Dark hair with threads of silver at the temples, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through everything, and a mouth that rarely smiled, but when it did, could stop her heart completely. Today, however, his expression was unreadable, almost cold. "Victoria?" He said her name like it was a business transaction. "Please, sit down." She perched on the edge of the leather chair across from his massive desk, watching as he moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Everything about James Sterling was controlled, calculated, perfect. It was what made him a billionaire by 30, and what made him absolutely terrifying to love. "I'm restructuring the company," he began, not meeting her eyes. His fingers drummed once against the desk surface, before he caught himself and stopped. "Your position is being eliminated." The words hit her like a physical blow. Victoria blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Effective immediately. He slid a sealed envelope across the polished surface toward her. "Everything you need to know is in there. Severance. References the standard package." Victoria stared at the envelope as if it might explode. For years of arriving early, staying late, remembering his mother's birthday when he forgot, coordinating his life down to the minute. For years of pretending she didn't notice how his eyes lingered on her sometimes, or how his voice softened when he said her name. For years of loving a man who apparently saw her as nothing more than office equipment to be discarded. "Is this because of Denver?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. James went very still. For a moment, the mask slipped. She saw something raw and vulnerable flicker across his features before. The wall slammed back into place. Denver, 3 months ago. The business conference that had changed everything between them. They had been stuck in the hotel bar during a blizzard that grounded all flights. Victoria had been nursing a single glass of wine, watching James methodically work through reports on his laptop. When the power went out, plunging the bar into flickering candlelight, he had finally looked up. "Do you ever stop working?" she had asked, emboldened by the wine and the intimate atmosphere. "Do you?" he had countered, but his tone was gentle, almost teasing. They had talked for hours. Real conversation, not about schedules or meetings, but about dreams, fears, the parts of themselves they kept hidden. James had told her about the pressure of carrying his father's legacy, about the loneliness of being responsible for thousands of jobs and billions in revenue. Victoria had shared her love of art, her secret dream of opening a small gallery someday. When he walked her to her room, they had lingered in the hallway. The air between them had been electric, charged with 4 years of unspoken attraction and 1 evening of genuine connection. "Victoria," he had whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. She had kissed him first, rising on her toes to press her mouth to his. He had responded with a hunger that had shocked them both. Backing her against the door, his hands tangling in her long black hair. They had made love with desperate tenderness, as if they both knew it was stolen time. James had been achingly gentle, worshipping her body with reverent touches and whispered endearments. Victoria had given him everything, pouring for years of hidden love into every caress. In the morning, he had been gone. A single white rose on the pillow where he had lain. No note, no explanation. When they returned to Seattle, he had retreated behind his professional mask so completely that Victoria sometimes wondered if she had dreamed the whole thing. Now, staring at the termination letter, she knew she hadn't dreamed anything. And apparently, neither had he. "Denver has nothing to do with this," James said, but his voice was rougher than usual. He turned back to the window, dismissing her without another word. Victoria stood on unsteady legs, picked up the envelope, and walked toward the door. Her hand was on the handle when she turned back. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I would have kept it professional if you had asked me to." "You didn't have to destroy my career to avoid an awkward conversation." He didn't respond. Didn't even turn around, but she saw his reflection in the window. Saw the way his jaw clenched and his hands fisted at his sides. Victoria left Sterling Industries for the last time that afternoon, clearing out her desk while the office buzzed with shocked whispers. 4 years of her life packed into a single cardboard box. Photos, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle, the small succulent plant James had once complimented. She drove home to her small apartment in Queen Anne, the Seattle rain matching her tears as they fell. Her savings account held maybe 3 months of expenses, if she was careful. Her references would be excellent, but jobs like hers were rare. And James Sterling's recommendation would open any door she wanted. Except he had just closed every door by making her departure look like a termination rather than a resignation. That night, Victoria sat on her couch with a cup of tea, staring at the city lights through her rain-streaked window. She thought about the way James had looked at her in Denver, the way he had whispered her name like a secret. She thought about the careful distance he had maintained afterward, and the cold dismissal in his voice today. James Sterling was brilliant, powerful, and utterly broken. Victoria had seen glimpses of the man behind the mask, as the one who still grieved for his father, who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders and trusted no one to help bear the load. She had fallen in love with both versions of him. The untouchable billionaire and the vulnerable man who had held her like she was precious beyond measure. Now, she was paying the price for that love, and she couldn't even bring herself to hate him for it. The tea grew cold in her hands as she made plans. Seattle was expensive, but she had skills, connections, determination. She would find another job, build a new life, forget about piercing blue eyes and the taste of whispered promises. What Victoria didn't know, as she finally fell asleep on the couch with the termination letter crumpled on the floor beside her, was that her life was about to become infinitely more complicated, and that the man who had just destroyed her career was about to discover he had made the biggest mistake of his life. 6 weeks had passed since Victoria. Chen walked out of Sterling Industries with her career in ruins and her heart shattered. The Seattle autumn had arrived with its usual gray persistence, painting the city in shades of melancholy that matched her mood perfectly. She sat in the cramped bathroom of her Queen Anne apartment, staring at the small plastic stick in her trembling hands. 2 pink lines. Clear, undeniable, life-changing. Victoria set the pregnancy test on the counter with careful precision, as if moving too quickly might make it disappear. Her reflection stared back from the mirror above the sink, pale and wide-eyed, still wearing the navy sweater she had thrown on for her morning job interview. The interview that had gone nowhere. Like all the others, she was pregnant with James Sterling's baby. The man who had fired her without explanation now lived. Inside her, in the most intimate way possible, Victoria pressed her hands to her still flat stomach, trying to process the magnitude of what this meant. A child, their child. Created during that one perfect night in Denver when the world had felt full of possibilities instead of closed doors. Her phone buzzed on the bathroom counter. A text from her best friend Rachel, asking how the interview had gone. Victoria ignored it. She couldn't think about job interviews or rent money, or the fact that her savings were dwindling. Faster than Seattle rainwater down a storm drain. All she could think about were James's hands on her skin, his voice whispering her name in the darkness. The way he had looked at her as if she was the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask. Victoria walked to her small kitchen and made tea with shaking hands. The familiar ritual calmed her nerves slightly. She sat at her tiny dining table and tried to think clearly. She was 28 years old, unemployed, and pregnant with a billionaire's child. A billionaire who had thrown her out of his life like yesterday's newspaper. The smart thing would be to call James, tell him about the pregnancy, discuss their options like rational adults. They were both educated, sophisticated people. Surely they could handle this with maturity and grace. Except Victoria remembered the cold dismissal in his voice that day in his office. The way he had turned away from her as if she was nothing, as if Denver had meant nothing. She remembered the weeks of professional distance after their night together. The careful way he had avoided being alone with her. The gradual freezing of his warmth until she was left wondering if she had imagined the whole thing. No, James Sterling had made his position clear. He wanted her out of his life, and she would respect that decision, even if it meant raising their child alone. Victoria spent the rest of the day researching prenatal care, health insurance options, and jobs that offered maternity leave. The practical side of her brain kicked into high gear, making lists and plans and calculations. She could do this. She was strong, capable, resourceful. She didn't need James Sterling or his money or his cold blue eyes that haunted her dreams. What she needed was a fresh start. 3 days later, Victoria was packing her apartment when she heard the knock on her door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the sound made her freeze with a sweater half folded in her hands. Through the peephole, she saw a man in an expensive suit holding a manila envelope. "Victoria Chen?" he asked when she opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Yes, I'm David Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I represent Sterling Industries. Mr. Sterling asked me to deliver this personally." Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. She took the envelope with numb fingers and closed the door without another word. Inside was a check that made her knees buckle and a single sheet of letterhead. The check was for $50,000. The letter was brief and formal, explaining that Mr. Sterling had reconsidered her severance package and felt this amount better, reflected her years of dedicated service. There was no personal note, no explanation, no mention of Denver or the night that had changed everything. Victoria stared at the check until the numbers blurred. $50,000 was more money than she had ever seen at once. It was enough to cover her expenses for a year, maybe more if she was careful. It was enough to see her through her pregnancy and give her time to find the right job, the right path forward. It was also guilt money, and they both knew it. She thought about tearing it up, about sending it back with a letter telling James Sterling exactly what he could do with his charity. But then she thought about the child growing inside her, about doctor visits and baby clothes and the 1,000 expenses that lay ahead. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Victoria deposited the check the next morning and used part of the money to put a deposit down on a small house in Bellingham. It's 2 hours north of Seattle. It was a cozy craftsman bungalow with a garden and enough space for a nursery. Far enough from Seattle to start over, close enough to civilization to build a new life. She found work at a local art gallery, exactly the kind of job she had always dreamed of. The pay was modest, but the owner, Helen Mackenzie, is a kind woman in her 60s who had raised 3 children as a single mother. When Victoria's pregnancy began to show, Helen simply adjusted her responsibilities and assured her that her job would be waiting after maternity leave. For the first time in months, Victoria felt like she could breathe. She decorated the nursery in soft greens and yellows, not knowing if the baby was a boy or girl and not wanting to know. She bought a rocking chair from an antique shop and spent evenings there, reading to her growing belly and talking about the life they would build together. "Your daddy is complicated," she would whisper, one hand curved over her stomach. "But don't worry, little one. We don't need complicated, we just need each other." Victoria told herself she meant it. She told herself she didn't lie awake at night wondering if James ever thought about her, if he had any idea what his night in Denver had created. She told herself she didn't scan every news article about Sterling Industries, looking for glimpses of his face or clues about his life. She was getting very good at lying to herself. Meanwhile, in Seattle, James Sterling was discovering that forgetting Victoria Chen was proving impossible. He threw himself into work with ruthless intensity, expanding the company's operations, closing deals that should have been impossible, building his empire with the single-minded focus that had made him a billionaire before 30. But late at night, alone in his penthouse apartment, he found himself staring at the city lights and remembering the way Victoria had looked in candlelight, the soft catch of her breath when he touched her, the trust in her eyes when she had given herself to him completely. He had tried to do the right thing by letting her go. Victoria deserved someone who could love her without reservation, without the walls and scars that made James dangerous to anyone who got too close. His ex-wife had learned that lesson the hard way. leaving him after 2 years with harsh words about his emotional unavailability and workaholic tendencies. Victoria was different. She had seen past his defenses to the man underneath, and that terrified him more than any business deal or corporate takeover. So he had pushed her away, told himself it was for her own good, and tried to move on. The $50,000 check had been an impulse born of guilt and sleepless nights. James told himself it was just business, a way to ease his conscience and ensure Victoria's financial security. He didn't let himself think about why her well-being mattered so much to him, or why he had his assistant quietly monitor her whereabouts to make sure the check had been received and deposited. He certainly didn't let himself think about the dreams that had been haunting him lately. Dreams of dark hair spread across white pillows, of whispered confessions in the darkness, of a life that could have been his if he had been brave enough to reach for it. James Sterling had built his fortune by taking calculated risks and making hard choices. But when it came to Victoria Chen, he had chosen safety over possibility, solitude over love. He was about to discover that some choices had consequences that couldn't be controlled or contained, no matter how much money or power you possessed. And that love, once awakened, had a way of demanding to be heard. 8 months had passed since Victoria moved to Bellingham. Her life had settled into a peaceful rhythm that she had never imagined possible. Her belly was round and prominent now, the baby due in just 4 weeks. She stood in the nursery of her little craftsman house, folding tiny clothes and arranging stuffed animals, when she felt the familiar flutter of movement inside her. "Getting restless in there, aren't you?" she murmured, placing both hands on her stomach. The baby responded with a strong kick that made her laugh. "Just like your father." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Victoria rarely allowed herself to think about James anymore. But as her due date approached, memories of him seemed to surface more frequently. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he had any idea that he was about to become a father. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Victoria made her way carefully down the stairs, one hand on the banister for support. Through the peephole, she saw a delivery man holding a large bouquet of white roses. "Victoria Chen?" he asked when she opened the door. "Yes, that's me." The roses were beautiful. At least 3 dozen of them arranged in an expensive crystal vase. Victoria's heart began to race as she carried them inside and searched for a card. Her hands trembled as she opened the small white envelope. "Congratulations on the gallery opening. Wishing you every success. J.S." Victoria sank onto her couch, staring at the card. The Bellingham Arts Festival had featured her gallery in their newsletter last week, highlighting her as one of the area's promising new business owners. Somehow, James had seen it. Somehow, he was still keeping track of her life. The roses sat on her coffee table like beautiful, fragrant questions. What did this mean? Was it simply professional courtesy, or something more? And how had he known about the gallery opening when she had been so careful to build her new life away from anything connected to Sterling Industries? Victoria spent the rest of the day trying to focus on preparing for the gallery's evening reception. But her thoughts kept drifting to Seattle, to a man with blue eyes who had once whispered her name in the darkness. She chose a flowing black dress that accommodated her pregnancy and twisted her hair into an elegant updo, trying to look professional and confident despite the emotional turmoil the roses had stirred up. The gallery reception was a success. Local art collectors mingled with wine glasses, admiring the paintings and sculptures Victoria had carefully curated. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, discussing pieces and making connections, but part of her mind remained elsewhere. It was nearly 9 o'clock when she saw him. James Sterling stood near the back of the gallery, partially hidden by a large abstract painting. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, and his dark hair was slightly mussed as if he had run his hands through it. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They were fixed on her with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade away. Victoria excused herself from the conversation she was having and walked toward him on unsteady legs. With each step, her heart hammered harder against her ribs. He looked older than she remembered, with deeper lines around his eyes and a weariness that hadn't been there 8 months ago. When she was close enough to speak without being overheard, she stopped. "James, Victoria." His voice was rougher than she remembered, heavy with emotion. His gaze dropped to her rounded belly, and she saw his breath catch. "You look beautiful. What are you doing here?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing it. "I saw the article about the gallery. I wanted to see what you had built, and it's everything you dreamed it would be." His smile was sad, proud, and broken all at once. "You've always had excellent taste." Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes. "James, I can't do this." "Not here, not now. I know." He reached into his jacket and pulled out another envelope. "This is yours. It was always yours." With trembling fingers, Victoria opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $200,000 and a deed to a building in downtown Seattle. Her old building where Sterling Industries was headquartered. But according to the deed, the top floor now belonged to her. "I don't understand," she whispered. "It's a gallery space. Prime location, fully renovated, ready for you whenever you want it." James's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the emotion underneath. "No strings attached. Consider it a very late severance package." Victoria stared at the papers, her mind reeling. "Why?" "Because I was wrong." The words came out rough and broken. "Because I was a coward who pushed away the best thing that ever happened to him. Because you deserved better than what I gave you." She looked up at him, searching his face. "James, there's something you need to know." "I know," he said softly. "I've known for months." Victoria's world tilted. "What?" "The private investigator I hired to make sure you were safe. He discovered the pregnancy 3 months ago." James's jaw clenched. "I've been going out of my mind wanting to contact you, wanting to be part of this, but I knew I had no right. Not after what I did." Anger flared in Victoria's chest, hot and sudden. "You've known for months and said nothing? What was I supposed to say? That I was sorry for destroying your life? That I wanted another chance I didn't deserve?" His composure cracked, and she saw the raw pain beneath. "I loved you, Victoria. I loved you so much it terrified me. When my father died, when my marriage fell apart, I learned that loving people meant losing them. I thought if I pushed you away first, it would hurt less." "And did it?" she asked quietly. "No." The word was barely a whisper. "It nearly killed me." Victoria felt the baby kick strongly, as if responding to the emotional intensity of the moment. She placed her hand over the movement, and James's eyes followed the gesture with wonder and longing. "Is it ... double quotes," he began, then stopped. "A girl," Victoria said softly. "She's due in 4 weeks." James closed his eyes as if absorbing a physical blow. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I know I have no right to ask, but could I? Could I be part of her life? I don't expect anything from you, but she's my daughter too, and I want to do right by her, even if I failed you." Victoria studied his face, seeing the man she had fallen in love with 4 years ago. Not the cold, controlled billionaire, but the vulnerable human being who carried too much weight on his shoulders and had forgotten how to trust and love. "What are you offering, James?" "Whatever you'll let me have. Child support, college funds, visitation rights, a chance to be the father she deserves." He paused, his voice dropping. "And if you'll have me, a chance to be the man you deserved all along." Victoria felt something shift inside her chest. It's like a door that had been locked tight finally opening. "I spent 8 months learning to live without you," she said. "Learning to be strong on my own, to believe I was enough just as I am." James nodded, his face falling. "I understand, I'm not finished." Her voice was firm, but gentle. "I learned that I don't need you to complete me or save me, but that doesn't mean I don't want you in my life." Hope flickered in his eyes. "If you want to be part of this, part of our daughter's life, then you need to understand something. I won't be your employee or your convenient arrangement. I'm a successful businesswoman with my own dreams and goals. If you want to be with me, it has to be as equals." "Yes," he said immediately. "Yes, absolutely." Victoria took a deep breath. "And I need to know that you won't run again. That when things get difficult or scary, you'll stay and fight for us instead of pushing us away." James stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne. could see the silver threading through his dark hair. "I spent 8 months learning to live without you two," he said softly. "It was the worst education of my life. I won't make that mistake again." The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Victoria winced slightly. James was beside her instantly, his hand hovering near her elbow. "Are you all right?" She smiled, the first genuine smile she had given him in almost a year. "She's excited. I think she knows her daddy is here." James's face transformed with wonder. "May I?" Victoria nodded and guided his hand to her belly. The moment his palm touched her dress, the baby kicked directly against his fingers. James laughed, a sound of pure joy that made Victoria's heart flutter. "Hello, little one," he whispered to her stomach. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner, but I'm here now. And I'm never leaving you or your mama again." Victoria felt tears slide down her cheeks as she watched this powerful, guarded man melt completely at the first touch of his unborn child. Maybe they could do this. Maybe love really could conquer the fear and mistakes that had kept them apart. 2 years later, Victoria stood in the penthouse gallery space of the Sterling building, watching James chase their toddler daughter Emma around the room while she squealed with delight. The gallery had become one of Seattle's most prestigious art venues, and Victoria had built a reputation as a curator with an eye for emerging talent. Emma had James's blue eyes and Victoria's dark hair, and she had wrapped both her parents completely around her tiny finger. James was an attentive, devoted father who never missed a bedtime story or a dance recital, and he had proven that he could balance his business empire with his family responsibilities. Victoria wore a simple white dress and carried a bouquet of white roses, the same flowers James had left on her pillow in Denver all those years ago. Their wedding was small, just family and close friends, held in the gallery surrounded by beautiful art and the Seattle skyline. As they exchanged vows, James promised to love her without fear, to stay and fight for their family no matter what challenges they faced. Victoria promised to trust in their love, to build a future together based on honesty and mutual respect. When he kissed her as his wife, Emma clapped her chubby hands and shouted, "Daddy," making everyone laugh. Later, as they danced to soft music while their daughter slept in James's mother's arms, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It hadn't been easy or simple, but it had been real. They had both made mistakes, both learned and grown, and both chosen love over fear. "No regrets?" James murmured against her ear as they swayed together. Victoria looked up at him, at this man who had fired her without mercy, only to discover that love couldn't be dismissed as easily as an employee. "Only one," she said. His face grew concerned. "What's that?" She smiled and pulled him closer. "That it took us so long to get here." James spun her around laughing. And Victoria knew that some love stories were worth the wait, even when they began with termination letters and ended with forever.